Welcome to Mont Park Model Railway. I've been working on a few projects that are a bit more long term, and I'm showing one of them to a good friend of mine, Gareth. He said, "Well, major works. Make sure you can afford before you build it, otherwise you may have to scrap it." During the original design of Mont Park Model Railway, I didn't appreciate the consequences of using only standard set points and not working through the operational scenarios, especially shunting back into Peterborough Yards. The reality is that real and model trains don't appreciate being shunted back through multiple curves, and definitely not the snake that was Peterborough Yards. The result was it was almost impossible to shunt any train back into the yards, and some tender loco combinations would also derail when reversing into the yards. This is my general idea how to solve the problem, and that is to replace the existing Hornby standard second radius set track points with Peco large radius points. The entry point will also be replaced with the curved one, which requires completely realigning the entry curve. This is essentially where it all starts. The yard entry point to be replaced with a curved version, and the curve to be increased from a second to a third radius. This will result in losing some of the small lead-in straight section, and we'll get to that and the consequences of that later in the video. I used the old third radius track outside template as a general guide to obtain a view to where the track alignment would need to go and what other modifications were likely needed, such as the landform on the inside of the curve. Well, in my first session, I got most of the points installed and reasonably happy with the overall outcome. As can be observed with the alignment of this train, it is much straighter. So I decided to bite the bullet and redo all the yard points. The change was getting earlier entry to allow using Peco large radius points, which also twice the length of the existing standard points. The solution was used a spare right-hand curve point and then sequence of Peco left-hand large radius points and finishing with the right-hand version. Some rudimentary measurements suggested it was possible with minimal loss of overall siding length. Reality was the existing yards were not usable and something needed to change. The next task is to relocate and reinstall all the point motors. Found a small problem with the curve adjacent to the curve point, where the new V2 test loco would slow and then stall. Essentially, the curve is too tight, especially when exiting the yards themselves, where the point curve is meant to be second radius. This video shows the curve is so tight the centre driving wheels is not touching the rail. Utilising the second radius track setter gauge, it becomes evident there is a kink in the junction of the point and the curve. This required unpinning the track and point, then using the track setter gauge through the curve point to remove the kink and at least a second radius curve. It can now be observed the change in the radius from the original alignment to the new third radius curve into the curve point. At the apex of the curve is a whole track width, which is a wider curve from the old second radius to about this third radius. This also includes the slightly earlier entry into the yards to accommodate the longer points. Just did a bit of touch-up painting of the old baseboard locations that had been vacated by the relocation of the track. Possibly the gap on the inside curve to the landform might be a little tight at 5mm. All the various coaches get past, but may take another 5mm off just to ensure that any of the American-style coaches could still pass, which are considerably longer than the UK equivalent. So I thought I was almost done, but then observe what's going on here. The tender kept derailing. A closer look finds the front wheel on the tender is dropping into the gap outside rail between the outside rail and the point blade. As we zoom in for a closer look, and sure enough, how is this occurring? This looks like a job for the trusty track standards gauge. As we move the gauge down closer between the rail and the point blade, we can observe there's almost a 2mm wide gap between the point blades and the stock rails. And the problem is not just at the point blade tip, but continues on for several centimetres. This is a problem with the Hornby standard set track points, which we've observed in one or two of the previous videos. Well, there's probably quite a few options. One could be to replace the existing Hornby point with a Peco equivalent, or remove the point altogether, or replace the existing all the Hornby points with Peco, or remove all the existing Hornby points and install a set of Peco large radius points prior to the existing express points. Decided to just replace the existing Hornby with a Peco point of the same size and leave the other points in that area as they were. And as we zoom in with the track gauge, it shows the difference with the new Peco version, where the rail gauge spacing is maintained. So we'll just do a quick flyover of the work, starting with the new yard entry and around to where it exits out back onto the main line. So as well as redoing all the points in the yard, which are related or triggered by another project I'm working on, and that's to put rail aligners at each of the board junctions around the layout. And so this particular one is one of the first ones where I've got a point in close proximity to a board joint. And so I'll just step through the process I went through of installing the Pro Track rail aligners for this particular scenario. This one required a small modification of the points by removing a couple of sleepers, and also had a rail join on the aligners, which is quite different to how most of my other aligners are installed. Well, I'm quite satisfied with the final result, which maintained a nice straight alignment of the rails also. And here's a view of the new updated yards. So at the bottom here we can see the new alignment coming in, the curve point, and then the series of Peco large radius points making their way all across the yards to the loco siding. The next task was to add the aligners to the loco stabling area. And yes, the joiners are everywhere, and I've got another video that's going through the 40 odd aligners I've got to install around Mont Park. And the first task is to snip out the sleepers, then slide the aligners into place underneath the rails. Then once getting the aligners under the rails and aligning it with the rails is to then align the aligner joint with the join in the baseboards. Now, I've generally been using Peco track pins to secure the aligners in position to the board. And what I do when I solder the aligners to the rails is just do first, I only just solder the outside of the rail to the sleeper outside tag. Now before soldering them all 6 tabs on each side, I just use my track standard gauge just to make sure that the spacing between the rails is still correct. Because once you solder them in, it's be very difficult to redo. I am now becoming a little bit more proficient in getting these in. So this only took me about 15 minutes to cut the sleepers away, slide the aligners in, align them, tack them, solder them, and get them all soldered in on all the tabs. Then just to finish them off, I normally run over them with the trusty old track rubber just to take any solder flux or other debris off the track so they're nice and clean. And just one final thing I do is run over the aligners with a black Sharpie marker to colour the aligner to blend in with a little bit better with the adjacent sleepers. And yes, I know that the sleepers aren't normally black, but that's how mine is at the moment, and maybe one day I'll paint them over. Well, that's all for this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.